There's no doubt, I think, to anyone who's looking, that Western civilization is waxing at the moment. It's struggling. It's something that's starting to erode from within. And the reason for that is because our culture here in the West has given itself over to a philosophical relativism that says that all truths are equal and that all moral systems are equal. And over the last 70 years, we've undergone a process of de-Christianization that has been pushed by groups like liberal progressives, secular humanists, who have sought to take away the Christian substance and the Christian content of our nation. The result of that has been that the Western civilization and Western society has given over its soul to consumerism, which has played onto the vices that are inherent within human nature. Now, centuries ago, a famous pope called Gregory took a list of what were called cardinal sins by a monk called Cassian, and he prepared an influential sermon called the 7 Deadly Sins that has influenced European culture ever since. And the moment I begin to list these 7 sins, they'll immediately become something, they'll immediately start to ring a bell to anyone who's undergone a Western education. However, when he compiled that list, he took one of the sins out because he thought that the laity didn't need it, that it was something for the monks. And it's that first sin that I want to start talking about. The first of the 8 deadly sins is called acedia. Now, acedia could be roughly translated as sloth or a lack of care about the inner man, about the spirit, about the self, about how we organize our thoughts, about how we organize the way that we think and the way that we understand ourselves. Because the truth of it is that without ordering the inner man, without structuring the inner person, the soul starts to spin out of control and gives itself over to license of every kind and description. And in the West, we have an absence of reflection upon the self. We have an absence of centering the self through meditation, through reflection, through ordering our mind and considering where our thoughts are. It's been said within Christian circles that you're not what you think you are, but what you think you are. Which, to break that down, means that the things that you think about are the things that control you. And we live in a society now that has given itself over to the desires and the passions of the inner man, which are wholly destructive and harmful to the individual. And when millions of people give themselves over to those same passions, it becomes harmful to society. So what are those passions? Those passions are known as the 7 deadly sins. One of them is gluttony. We have a problem in the West with our obsession with food. We have more people now who are obese, eating the wrong foods and eating to excess because they don't live in a culture that teaches them restraint or teaches them moderation, because they don't practice that sense of self-reflection that leads to discipline and the ordering of the mind. People are addicted to food, and if they're not addicted to food, they have anxieties about food. There's an increase in obesity, there's an increase in anorexia, and these problems are rooted in malformations of the soul, in the fact that in the West we've abandoned the idea as a soul as an idea. We think it's all about the body and the mind. But the soul is the thing that gives you life and sets you free if it is set free by the truth. Gluttony is destroying many lives. Another one of the passions that is destroying Western civilization is lust. Lust is destroying Western civilization because as people are giving themselves over simply to the pursuit of sex as an end in itself and not as a means to a better end, they are destroying the family. They are treating sex as a form of entertainment, which is ruining the culture, spreading diseases, and ruining the idea of family, because people don't want to give up their fun to take on the real responsibility of having a family, of giving birth to children. Lust is something that captivates the heart and takes over the mind and leads people in a direction that is wholly destructive. When a society gives itself over to that passion without restraint, then it is something that leads to the destruction and the downfall of that society. Demographically, the West is collapsing. And the West is collapsing because the West has given up on the idea of the family in its entirety. We think that our self is the highest authority, which brings us on to the next of the deadly sins, which is pride. This idea that human pride is the highest authority, that because I feel something or because I think something, no one can correct me. So we've got to a point now in this country where a man can say he's a woman and a woman can say that they're a man, and no one can point out to them the obvious. Now, if I said to you that I'm really a Brazilian lesbian trapped in a man's body, you would all see that for the obvious silliness that it is. If I said to you I identified as a black man, you would all say to me, you're stupid, and you would be right for saying so. But we live in a country, and the Western civilization has given itself over to pride, to the idea that an individual cannot be corrected. And it doesn't just express itself at an individual level. There are nationalists who seem to think that saying I am English is somehow the winning argument, that saying I am British and therefore Britain is the best, that makes us the greatest. It's all foolishness. It's all false pride. Pride is not to be taken in and of ourselves, but in what God has done, in what God is doing, and in what God is doing in you. Another one of the deadly sins is greed. If you can't see greed in our society, just look at consumerism. Look at its destructive forces. Look at how it is harming Western civilization, the world around us. People are measuring themselves based upon how much they own, how much they earn, and they're competing with one another to have the latest gadgets. This consumerist market is not just destructive to us, it's destructive to the planet. It's created an economic system that cannot possibly be sustained. Greed is another one of the destructive passions that needs to be dealt with. Another one of the destructive passions that's so prevalent in our society is despair. Many people in our society have given up within. They have given up because they feel alienated from the processes of identity. They have given up because they feel that there is no hope, that they are subject to circumstances which they cannot control. This despair leads people to throw themselves into distractions, into lust, into greed. They think that they can find meaning, that they can find some way of soothing the inner pain in their heart through purchasing something or through having a certain experience that momentarily can take them away from the anguish that they're feeling within, because their heart lacks hope. Another one of the destructive forces, the passions in our society, is wrath. All too often in the UK, we compensate for our lack of confidence with anger. We think that anger and fury aimed at those that do not agree with us is the correct response. A perfect example of this is the liberal left, the social justice warriors, who think that anyone who criticizes them or their ideas suddenly must be labeled and attacked and silenced. This wrath only gives way to destructive forces. We see it in Islamists who themselves cannot comprehend that the reason why the caliphate failed was because of the internal structures of the caliphate, and so they respond by thinking that fury, wrath and violence is the way to respond to the internal failures of Islam. Vainglory is equivalent to national pride. We see vainglory. It's this boasting about nothing. Celebrities do it all the time, and we have a culture that celebrates vainglory. We celebrate Rooney because he kicks a bag of wind around a football pitch. It's vainglory. We celebrate the Kardashians. Why? Because she appeared, I don't celebrate her, just to be clear, because she appeared in a porn movie with her now husband. This is vainglory. These are not things to celebrate, and yet we have a culture that celebrates everything that is unimportant while celebrating things that are unimportant. Finally, those are the vainglories, those are the passions that is destroying the West. So what are the answers according to the Christian faith? It's the practice of virtue. It's the practice of chastity, not giving yourself over to lust, restraining yourself from sex, keeping sex for marriage, and keeping marriage as a sacred institute by which we bring children into the world. It's temperance. It's not giving yourself over to the desires that simply consume you, but restricting yourself and ordering your life so that you have what you need and not more. Uncle Jamal, before you start, please let me finish.
No, I'm not a stop. And you, let me.
Let me finish.
Let me.
Let me finish.
Let
Justice.
Let
me finish.
Listen, you speak rubbish.
Justice.
Listen.
I'm
Speak
speaking
no
to
God.
you.
I am not listening him.
Okay.
And the gentleman is crazy.
Because Uncle Jamal
And I am
has
Muslim.
come to do his normal thing, I'm not going to debate with him. I'm not going to
Gentleman.
speak disrespectfully to him because he is my elder. I'm going to move away.
Wait.
You have the stage, Uncle Jamal. So
Okay.
me and Soco Films are going to move away,
Allah.
and we're going to film somewhere else. Take care, Uncle Jamal. Okay, so in terms of justice, justice is a virtue to be practiced. Justice is defending those who are weakest in our society, those who are socially excluded, the vulnerable. Prudence means to act with wisdom. It means not to get yourself in debt or simply to give yourself over to some other desire, but to consider your actions before you perform them. Faith. Faith is the idea of trusting in God and realizing that the circumstances around us are not simply the factors that affect our lives, that there are things and movements within our soul that can influence the direction of our life. And faith is putting our trust in a higher power, in a power beyond ourselves, in a power beyond our circumstances, that can improve the inner man and thus improve our life's condition. Hope, the answer to despair, is to remember that no matter the plight that you're facing, there is always another day. That while ever you draw breath, you have the capacity to make your life better. Charity, the answer to many of these vices that I've listed, is compassion, is the ability to focus yourselves on helping others and bringing meaning to your own life by demonstrating that life's purpose through self-sacrifice and through assisting those others in need, rather than the pursuant of simple things like fashions and whether you're keeping up with the Joneses next door. Diligence, the idea of when you do something, do it with care, do it with thought, do it with consideration, so that the things that you put your hand to are things that you succeed in. Too many of us give ourselves over to sloth, one of the vices of doing things lazily. Patience. In all things you need patience, because learning to do life well is about practice, and practice needs patience. It's bearing in mind that you're not going to get it right the first time, but by doing it again and again and persisting, you will eventually succeed. And finally, gratitude. If you're not thankful for what you have, then you give yourself over to no greater meaning. How many times do we hear people complaining about inconsequential things when they have a roof over their head, clean water to drink, food to eat, clothes to wear, and good health? And yet they complain because maybe their job's not right, or maybe they haven't got this particular aspect of their life in order, or that particular aspect of their life in order. Not remembering the things that you have and being grateful for them open up the heart to despair. And so what we see is that Western civilization is dying because it has forgotten the truths of our Christian forefathers, who knew these truths about the inner man, about the soul, about the being, and used these truths to guide how they lived their lives and how they structured themselves. Western civilization will continue to collapse until the Western man remembers the Christian past and rediscovers their Christian faith with confidence and strength.
You see, when you said that the Western society is suffering from pride and what was the other one? Was it
Vainglory,
ego?
envy.
Exactly. You know, especially when it comes to pride, isn't when it comes to religion, don't they covertly, indirectly try to promote the idea of pride? As in, for example, a lot of religious people tend to say that when they accept their faith, you know, fully they accept their faith, they tend to say that only my way is truth and every other path is wrong. Indirectly, isn't that already pride? So religion itself covertly promote pride without the religious person actually knowing that he's actually practicing pride by saying that only through Jesus or only through the Sikh gurus or only through Muhammad or Islam that you can attain salvation, and any other way it's, you know, it's wrong. If you know what I'm saying, it's more like my way or the highway, but some people tend to put it in a nicer way, if you know what I mean. So don't that religion also tend to like promote pride sometimes, and that can also build up your ego, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, may I reply?
Yeah, sure. Go for
So
it.
if you remember when I was talking, I said that we shouldn't take pride in ourselves or in what we have done, but in what God has done and in what God is doing in us.
Yeah.
So I qualified pride quite deliberately, because what you're saying is in a way kind of true, but I think it's about the way that we interact with one another. You know, so like me and you are having a religious discussion now. I say to you with complete sincerity and honesty that I believe that the Lord Jesus Christ is the only way to heaven. However, I hope that I'm not coming across as a proudful person who's speaking to you as if you're beneath me. You know, you have an opinion, and I'm engaging with that opinion. Because if we believe that God is truth, and I do, then that means that when we fix ourselves on that truth, we can speak with confidence. Now, the false pride is when we take pride in what I have done. Or another kind of false pride is nationalism. This is a kind of false pride. These things are destructive precisely because what they do is separate. However, truth is something that unites. Something because we can both stand on it. You know? So if I say to you that Christ is the truth, what I'm doing is, you know, I'm inviting you to examine the claim, and then you can examine it, and then you can make your own decision.
But that would be that would be a subjective truth, because when it comes to religion or the concept of God, there is no such thing as the truth, because the truth does not exist. For you, Christ might be the truth, but for someone else who practices a different philosophy or different religions, someone else might be the truth or the way to salvation or heaven or nirvana or whatever they like to call it. So when it comes to religion, it's very difficult for all the concept of God. It's very difficult for us to establish a whole truth, because
May I
yeah, sorry, yeah.
So do you, just so that I don't want to put words in your mouth, do you believe that all truths are subjective?
Yes. Only when it comes to religion and the concept of God.
Okay. So, do you believe that the truth that you have just said is subjective as well?
Yes.
So, can you explain to me how you have given us an objective truth, this idea that all truths are relative, when you've just admitted that it is only a subjective truth?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. It's very difficult to define an objective truth when we speak about religion and concept of God, because we cannot agree to come up with an objective truth.
Okay,
It's
so
very difficult.
in terms of objective truths, I think there are two avenues to objective truth. Firstly is revelation, and secondly is natural order. Now, which one do you want to talk about?
When it comes to, sorry?
So I believe there's two ways to truth: revelation and natural order. So what I mean by natural order is the order in the world. So there are clear truths within the ordering of the world that point towards an objective truth. And revelation itself is also a direct truth. Now, the Christian faith is a historical faith. So if I use it by contrast, Hinduism or the Nordic religions of old European paganism, these are mythological religions. So they're mythological religions in the sense that they have stories that communicate truths, and these truths are considered spiritual truths, and they give over values and beliefs, but they're not said to be rooted in history. So the Vikings used to believe in Thor and Odin, and they communicated values about courage and valor and war. But the Vikings didn't really believe that Thor had come down in history, or that Odin really came down in history. These were mythological things. Christians really believe in the prophets, and we really believe that Jesus Christ was born of a Virgin Mary, was crucified on a cross, and rose again from the dead. It's rooted in history. So in that sense, I'm proposing to you a truth that can be investigated historically. Investigated and validated or invalidated historically. So if we take the subject of the resurrection, you know what Christians believe about the resurrection. Christ rose bodily from the dead. Now, we have certain ways to think about the resurrection. We can say that it never happened, we can say that it was faked, or we can say that it really happened. Now, out of those three perspectives, which do you lean towards?
I would say I don't know. I think
That's fine.
I would say I don't know. I seriously I don't know.
Okay, so when I say to you, as a Christian, that I believe that the Christian faith is the truth, what I'm proposing to you is a historical event that you can research historically. So how do we go about researching something historically? And I'm not asking you to do it here on Speaker's Corner. I'm just going to lay out the platform, and then you guys can do it in your own time. Or if you want to talk about it a bit more, we can do so.
Yeah, it's fine.
So the way you investigate something historically is you see what evidence there is, what documents there are, what were people saying at the time. You see if there's physical evidence, is there pottery, swords. You know, if someone says there was a battle somewhere and you find a thing that you think is the field, do you find lots of swords there? You know, you see what the historical accounts talked about. So we have historical accounts about Julius Caesar coming to the UK, or to Britannia, as it was known then, by the Romans. Historical accounts, documents. Well, the resurrection has documents. The resurrection is testified to by the historical account of the church. And the question that I would propose to you, and to anyone else who wants to consider the question, is that what was it that so convinced the first Christians that Christ had risen from the dead? That's the question I proposed.
I don't know. I wasn't there. To be extremely honest, sir, I can't answer that question because I wasn't there.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
And so in terms of answering a historical question, unless your position is we can know nothing about the past, is that your position?
No, my position is we cannot establish everything for 100% certainty about the past, because the thing is, you know, we live in a world that even words, what I say now, can be twisted 5 minutes later by a brother who's listening down here.
The Muslim
over there.
the Muslim Dawah team,
Yeah.
the Muslim Dawah team comes to Speaker's Corner and they twist the Bible all the time.
Yeah.
They always are misquoting the Bible.
Yeah.
Because and yet they would cry baby when I misquote the Quran, and I can misquote the Quran, and I know when I'm misquoting the Quran. The point that I'm doing when I misquote the Quran is to show the double standard of people who misquote the Bible.
Yes, that's
However,
that's smart.
let me just read to you this passage, okay? Now, I want you to start from this assumption. I believe Jesus Christ rose from the dead. I believe that.
Okay.
But on my testimony, you shouldn't believe, because I am not an eyewitness.
Yep.
I believe because someone told me to believe, and I was convinced to believe.
Exactly.
Incidentally, for those that want to know, it was a Muslim.
So you believe it through authority.
I believe it through authority. However, the very first Christians didn't believe because someone told them, because there was no one there to tell them. They were the very first. And they were the apostles. And we have one of their letters here, and here's what it says. It says, "And I will also be diligent that at any time after my departure you will be able to call these things to mind. For we did not follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses." That's Peter. John also says in his gospel that he too was a witness. Now, John's gospel was written by the community being taught by John.
So, so
Yeah.
does that mean it was a group? Or
Yeah, community.
right.
Authorship.
I always assume it was an individual.
Yeah, authorship 2,000 years ago is not like what we think of authorship today. They were not a book-based society. People didn't walk around with books like we do now. So authorship in the first century was not necessarily about the one who put pen to paper. It's about the source of the material. It's about the source of the material in terms of the one that is considered the author of it. So it's not necessarily the person that puts pen to paper. Now, in terms of John's gospel, it says, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things." So in other words, the author is saying that where he's getting it from the disciple who is testifying of these things, and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. So the gospel is claiming the authorship of a disciple, a witness. So my question to you is, the people that wrote the New Testament are witnesses to events that changed their life. They're claiming that the thing that changed their life was Christ rose from the dead. So the logical next question to ask is, did it happen? If it did, then you and everyone else should become a Christian. If it didn't, then I need to stop being a Christian. And if it was faked, I need to stop being a Christian. But whatever the conclusion we draw, we have to support it with evidence, because it's an historical inquiry deserving an historical investigation. And the way that you do that is you get together the evidence and then you come up with a narrative that accommodates all the evidence. That's how you create a historical investigation. So the evidence that we have is that in the first century, a group of people started going around Jerusalem and Palestine saying that Christ who was crucified had risen from the dead. Now even skeptics like Bart Ehrman, who the Muslim Dawah team is very fond of quoting, does not deny the crucifixion. In fact, no historian denies the crucifixion. Even Muslims, like Ahmadidat, who's a Muslim polemicist attacking Christianity all the time, even he, in his arguments, accepts the crucifixion, which means that Christ died on a cross. If Christ died on a cross, why did his followers, 3 days later, start saying that he had risen from the dead? That's the question I propose to you.
I seriously don't know. I don't know about that story.
So,
yeah. I know that the Christians believe that he rose from the dead.
So why?
But I think that the Muslims tend to disagree with them, because I think they say that he appeared to be.
They say that someone in his likeness appeared and was crucified.
Yeah.
But let's just consider that logic. Let's use that theory. So let's just use that theory and consider the consequences. If we use the theory of the Islamic Dawah team that says Christ wasn't really crucified, that he was raised up to Allah because Allah wouldn't allow his prophet to be humiliated, and that someone else died in his place. So who was it that the early Christians saw that convinced them that Christ had risen from the dead?
I have no idea. I don't know.
Exactly.
I'm just saying.
They have no answer.
That's just two different arguments. I think you should raise the argument to the Muslims.
When they took that body down, that was the image of Christ, that was a fake Christ, and they buried him in the tomb, it means that that tomb should still have a body. So who took the body?
I have no idea. I don't know. I'm just saying that there's two different arguments.
But this is why I don't believe in the Islamic
Muslim
narrative.
argument, all right.
And also, you've got to bear in mind that they're basing their argument on a book that was written 600 years later in a completely different country, in a totally other language, by a man that never saw anything, and whom there are no witnesses to him receiving revelation. No one ever saw the angel Gabriel speak to Muhammad. No one ever heard the angel Gabriel speak to Muhammad.
Sorry to cut you off, brother. I agree with all that, yeah, but then I think like I'm not in a position for you to throw a Muslim argument at me because I can't back it up. I think Muslims
but we're
sat down-
dealing with that theory.
Yeah.
You
So-
proposed it as a theory. I'm responding to the theory that you proposed. Now, since that does not match the evidence, it doesn't account for the claim of the first church. We're back to our original question.
Yeah.
What
Why did
accounts
people- yeah.
for the first Christians going around saying Jesus had risen from the dead? Let me propose a theory to you. It really happened. That accounts for the fact that we have people going round and saying that Jesus had risen from the dead. But maybe they were lying. Okay,
Yeah.
for what
We-
reason?
We don't know though, that's the thing.
Well,
We
let's
don't know.
explore that theory. We've discounted the idea that it never happened. Let's explore the idea that it was faked. That the first apostles faked it. What would be their motive? Normally people trick other people because they want to gain something, don't they? I might lie to you about something because I want to convince you of a point. Or I might lie to you because I want to defraud you of money. Or I might lie to you because I want you to vote a certain way. People lie because they hope to gain. That's pretty loud. They hope to gain by something, don't they? So we must assume that if the apostles were lying, they were lying because they hoped to gain. But what did they gain? Except their own deaths. Every single one of the apostles was martyred except for the apostle John. Thomas was martyred in India. Did you know that?
No, was it Mumbai?
I don't know. It was near in Kerala or
Kerala, yeah, South
yeah.
India.
He was martyred in Kerala. Peter was martyred in Rome. Paul was martyred in Rome. Mark was martyred in Egypt. Now, if you were lying about something, and someone came up to you and said, "Look, dude, like we've had enough of this. If you keep saying these lies, we're going to kill you dead." Would you stop lying to save your own life?
Yeah. I would, yeah.
And so would I.
Yeah, I would.
And there's a historical example of this. There used to be, I can't remember exactly the dates, so I'm not going to give a date. But there used to be a Jewish guy in the time that the Ottomans ruled Palestine. And it started to go round that he was the Messiah. And the Ottoman Turks and the Jews were starting to gather around him and they were starting to become a little bit rebellious. And the Ottoman Turks arrested him and said, "Look, dude, you put an end to this idea or we're just going to kill you." He converted to Islam, he denied that he was the Messiah. The first apostles all died believing and preaching that Jesus had risen from the dead. So the question is, what so convinced them to do so?
I don't know.
So
Again, I have
propose
no
to you
idea.
again.
Yeah, I have
The
no
answer that fits the evidence is that it really happened. That's the answer that I give to you. Yeah? Sorry?
He was risen from the dead, so what?
He was risen from the dead, so
Lots
what?
of people come back from the dead.
This is true, absolutely.
Are they all Jesus Christ?
So,
What's so miraculous of that if lots of people have come back from the dead?
in answer to the question, there are other accounts in the Old Testament of people rising from the dead. There are accounts in the New Testament of people rising from the dead. There are even today, exactly, you beat me to it. You beat me to it, brother. There are even accounts today of people rising from the dead.
Jesus Christ?
So why is it important? Because the apostles taught that this was the authentication of his teaching. That this was the authentication, the mark, the miracle that authenticated his claim to be the Messiah.
It's not a miracle, is it? If lots of people are dead,
When someone comes back from the dead, that is a miracle.
Today is a miracle.
Yes. If someone comes back from the dead today, I consider it a miracle.
No, suppose they were pronounced dead, but they weren't really dead. Is that
So
a
what you're
miracle?
saying is they never came back from the dead, so we're not talking about a miracle.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that when you say dead, you mean dead, not someone who's not dead.
Why would somebody be put in the mortuary here if they were not pronounced dead?
Well, I'm just going off what you said. You said, what happens if they were dead but not really dead? If they're not really dead, they're not dead, so it's not a miracle.
Could that have happened to Jesus?
No.
Why not?
So, in
Why
answer
not?
to...
Why not?
May I answer?
Yes.
Okay. Christ was crucified. He was whipped and he was tortured and he was stabbed. The Romans, when they came to knock out the knees of the other people that were still with the Christ, why did they do that? They did that because crucifixion is death by asphyxiation. That's actually what kills you with crucifixion. It's asphyxiation. So if you can push yourself up by the knees, then that means you can continue to breathe, because it's the compression of the lungs on the pancreas that prevents you from breathing. So when they came to Jesus, having knocked out the knees of the other two people next to him, they saw that he was already dead. They saw that he was already dead. The testimony of the first people. Just for good measure, they didn't break his knees. Just for good measure, they stuck him with a spear. And it says, out came blood and water. Blood and water begin to separate post-mortem.
No, it doesn't.
Yes, it does.
No, it doesn't.
If I cut you right now, what will come out will not be blood and water separated.
Yeah, but
Blood and water separates post-mortem.
no, you don't know anything about it. If you take a sample of blood
Yeah.
and you put it in a centrifuge,
Yes.
yes,
Go on. What happens to the centrifuge?
and when you spin it,
Thank you.
it come up. Yes,
It spins. Yes.
But you're
The
not listening to what I'm
Yes,
saying.
but the centrifuge is what separates the water from the blood. The centrifuge is what separates the water from the blood.
yes. But it
What I'm
could-
saying is, when they stabbed him with the spear, water and blood came out.
but it could happen under normal conditions as well.
No, I'm listening. That's right.
One question I want to ask you, the Christian.
Pray.
Go on.
Do you believe that Jesus died for your sins?
Yes, I do.
You do.
I do.
If you were at the crucifixion,
If I was at the crucifixion,
yeah,
let's do the thought experiment.
and you saw them doing all these wicked things to Jesus,
Yeah.
these wicked people who crucified Jesus,
Yeah.
what would you have done?
It's a really good question. Oh, can I just so that I can put it in context? In your hypothetical situation, am I aware of why Jesus is doing it or not?
Mind you, I put it in a hypothetical question, but I suspect there were people like you at the crucifixion, right?
There were people that loved Jesus at the crucifixion.
And they knew that he was going to die for their sins, right?
I don't know. I'm not aware that they were.
But they were like you. You believe that?
No, hold on. I believe because of the testimony of the church.
Testicles.
The testimony of the church. Yeah. No, I didn't say that, brother. That's just your obsession with body parts. That's your obsession. That's your obsession with those body parts. That's your obsession with those body parts. I'm not calling you a pervert. You just called yourself a pervert.